going to be presenting on my analysis of Blackness and Criminality, Whiteness and Governance in the Isle of Pines. The established scholarly discourse surrounding the Isle of Pines has analyzed how, as Amy Boesky argues in her 1995 article, the Isle of Pines is a contradictory master narrative, simultaneously legitimizing the power of the master and revealing that power to be dangerous, self-limiting, and artificial. To that extent, governance needs the spectacle of Black deprivation and Black depravity to assert its own exceptionality and necessity. In this regard, Boesky's analysis that even the Phils' roles of resistance have been determined for them by their masters certainly seems to prove true from a dominant narrative perspective. However, I feel that this reading of Naville's satirical utopia as a self-fulfilling prophecy of dystopia frames the destiny of governance as something carried out through the will of governance alone, where even the failures of governance are a product of governance's own will, not the will of the ones who revolt against it. It upholds the myth that the only narrative power belongs to the master narrative, and it leaves the Phils trapped in a narrative that isn't their own. In my approach to analyzing Isle, I have sought to combine some of the pivotal works in Black radical criticism by Hortense Spillers, Fred Moten, and Stefano Harney in the hopes of carving out a space in future Isle discourse for a Black primary meta-narrative that moves within and beyond the dominant narrative control. The contradiction of the master narrative in my analysis is less about how governance, i.e. the Pines, needs the spectacle of Black, i.e. Philian deprivation and Black depravity to assert its own exceptionality, necessity, and control, and more about what new conclusions we can draw about the nature of narrative power and resistance if we interpret the undynamic objects of the master narrative as objectified dynamic subjects with primary narratives of their own. Beginning with Spillers' commentary on ethnicity, the white body, and the Black flesh, Spillers defines ethnicity not just as a racialization of the Black body, but a racialization that operates in a similar manner to how George Pine characterizes the Phils, according to Boesky, where he separates them as race and renders them subordinate. Ethnicity is a scene of negation inscribed on the Black flesh, the writing on the socially conceptualized wall of Blackness, wherein the thing being negated by this marking is the personhood of the body on the basis of phenotypic characteristics, i.e. skin color, hair type, eye color, etc. As Spillers demonstrates, we must think of ethnicity in its original form as racial slavery. According to Spillers, whether the captive body has been liberated or not, the flesh is still captive in the ruling episteme that releases the dynamics of naming and valuation, remaining grounded in the originating metaphors of slavery, so that it is as if the human subject is murdered over and over again in sacrifice to the preservation and assertion of the white body and biopolitics. Under ethnicity's ruling episteme, the white body is a liberated subject position and the Black flesh is the captive subject position, whose primary experience is trapped under the perception of the master narrative. So, let's define our terms for analysis. Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's definitions of governance as an extension of whiteness on a global scale and governance as the harvesting of the means of social reproduction are represented in Isle through white Puritan domesticity and the laws that enshrine its protection. Here I've made a diagram of what we've covered so far. This diagram represents the originating scene of negation, or the, quote, originating metaphors of slavery that the ruling episteme, which we can think of as the master narrative, is grounded in. Enclosing the white body is the white domestic sphere, and enclosing the Black flesh is the undomestic sphere of the hold of a slave ship. The blue arrows and blue dots are the means of social/kinship reproduction, and the red dots are Black flesh, or the commodification of Black bodies into personless flesh. So let us define domestic and undomestic as well. According to Spillers, domesticity appears to gain its power by way of a common origin of cultural fictions that are grounded in the specificity of proper names, more exactly a patronymic, which in turn situates those persons it covers in a particular place. In contrast, the human cargo of a slave vessel, in the fundamental effacement and remission of African family and proper names, offers a counter-narrative to notions of the domestic. Slave law followed the rule of partus sequitur ventrum, literally offspring follows belly, which, as Boesky states, made the mother-slave status a slave-linked condition through which slavery was passed from one generation to the next. While the slave trade relied on the ability of the enslaved woman to reproduce offspring, the condition of the slave as property required that slaves be considered incapable of producing kinship and denied the right of claiming kinship. This forcing of black bodies out of the domestic was not merely through an exclusion from the white domestic sphere, but out of their own domestic sphere and cultural contexts. Here is an updated graphic. So the white domestic sphere is the privatized site of the social reproduction of personhood and identity, and the undomestic sphere is a site of dislocation, cultural unmaking, and the violent atomization of the black body into masses or chunks of flesh to be sold through the process of slavery. We see this domestic dislocation reflected in Isle when Philippa is initially cut off from the sphere of white domesticity owing to her enslaved ethnic social status. In their first nights on the island, Pine and the other 3 white women, fearing being found out by the wild people of the country and in fear of wild beasts, decide that the Blackmore, being less sensible than the rest, we made our sentry. Her placement in this scene demonstrates exclusion from the white domestic sphere. Pine and his white wives constitute the white domestic sphere, Philippa, the undomestic black flesh. However, in an instance of white-monitored sexual subversion, an important exchange occurs. Moving to the next slide, I've further outlined how the hoarding of the means of social reproduction to the white domestic sphere by governance and the denial or theft of black kinship by governance are interrelated in Isle. Furthermore, it is the site of Philippa's and then her son's black-instigated reproductive/sexual miscegenation that is portrayed as a corruption of the white body by black flesh in the master narrative. The corruption aspect is the pathologization of black flesh as sexual and moral corruption. What I am interested in is the theft aspect that the narrative focus on corruption attempts to conceal. I'm interested in what is really being stolen in this so-called crime of black hypersexuality. Black hypersexuality in Isle represents the white fear of a black theft of the means of social reproduction, which would threaten the white domestic sphere's monopoly on kinship reproduction. As Spillers points out, under the constant state of breach and forced dispersal that the slave trade imposed on enslaved black families, black sociality and social organization became a way for enslaved Africans to build networks of support that transcended blood relations and generated a form of fugitive kinship in its own right. Recalling the paradox of slavery being a kinless state and the law of partus sequitur ventrum that needed slaves to reproduce offspring without being allowed kin or parental claim, then what ethnicity imposes on the black flesh is the means of reproduction deprived of the social claim. It is the social part in the means of social reproduction, therefore, that is being reclaimed by black hypersexuality, making the threat to governance more than anything else the threat of black sociality. Furthermore, as Moten contextualizes black criminalization as originating in the same ruling episteme of slavery as Spillers outlines, he highlights that it was the threat of black social organization under slavery that led to the most successful modes of slave rebellion, including networks of fugitive slaves helping other slaves escape and armed slave revolts. We see this reflected in Isle by the laws versus the execution. So sexual transgressions such as ravishing or adultery are both outlawed on pain of death by burning in the Pines legislation, but when Henry and John are convicted of adulterous ravishings, they are not burned as those laws dictate. The only law in Isle that dictates a punishment of expulsion of the suspect from the society of others, and the only one that matches the Phil's punishment, is the 6th law. While they are not whipped with rods, their flesh is already marked by the slave whip, as Spillers notes, via their ethnicity, their relation to their enslaved mother. In taking a closer look at the crimes of Henry Phil and John Phil, we see that John Phil commits fugitive flight and Henry Phil commits armed revolt, the two most threatening manifestations of black sociality in the eyes of whiteness as governance. The real threat beneath the specter of black hypersexuality in Isle is a black reclaiming of the means of sexual reproduction that the white domestic sphere and the law that protects it has seized. Black fugitivity and revolt is punished to assert whiteness as governance, but the black sociality that leads to fugitivity and revolt against white governance does not need to assert itself through fugitivity and revolt to have already been reproducing and generating sociality. It is before the law in every sense. Fugitivity and revolt in the context of black criminality as black sociality is to steal away with the black social life that one has not been lawfully allowed, within and through a mode of sociality that came before and exists regardless of the law that cannot contain, control, or prevent it. In this way, Philippa, John, and Henry all engage in and generate fugitive modes of black kinship and sociality outside the control of white governance and outside any detectable domesticity. The master narrative of Isle cannot let this go unpunished, nor can it acknowledge that this is the actual shape of the so-called crime. For if governance acknowledges the existence of the unregulated social reproduction of black kinship/sociality, it would mean acknowledging the existence of an alternative fugitive route to family liberation and life that does not need and in fact outright rejects what white civilization has rejected it. White domesticity and the law and order that upholds it would thus lose its legitimacy and necessity, because it would no longer be protecting any exclusive privilege. My analysis acknowledges what the master narrative and previous discourse has not. The Phils cannot be trapped by the master narrative or the law in Isle, just as black social life cannot be trapped by whiteness as governance, because it moves not as a single being, but as a sea of beings connected by ties of sympathy and resistance beyond the confines or recognition of whiteness as governance and the master narrative.